With hundreds of products and decades of experience each, Roland and Yamaha have proven themselves time and time again to be capable of putting out electronic music products that are capable of the highest quality. Or at least are pretty interesting. From analog and virtual analog to sample preset boxes, virtual acoustics, wind controllers, FM synths, audio interfaces, digital synths, and more, they've both done a lot, and with such accomplishments, there's doubtlessly going to be overlap. And with overlap comes online debates and opinions. Should I buy a JP8000 or an N1X? What's better for me, a Motif or a Phantom? Is the D50 really that good, or should I buy a DX7 for my nostalgia? Is the SY77 better than a JD800? You could honestly go on forever about what synthesizer is better for a task between just those two brands, and that extends to the world of desktop music. Given that I've already peered into Roland's side of the story with episodes on the three most important sound canvas models as well as the MT32, I feel it's time to take the spotlight away from Roland and look at the other side of the spectrum, the Yamaha MU series. Starting in 1994 with the MU80 and ending around 1999 with the MU2000, the MU series was Yamaha's attempt to get a share of the lucrative home computer music market. While other companies like Korg, Kurzweil, and Kawai would all attempt to get into it, it was really only Roland and Yamaha who managed to have any level of success, as well as spawn Fred after Fred, arguing which of the two were better, but we're not here to debate today. This episode is going to focus on the merits of the MUs. Retroactively touted by Yamaha as the ultimate PCM tone generator for their time, the MU series offered a ridiculous amount of content on paper for their cost. Being some of the earliest devices to support Yamaha's new Extended General MIDI Standard, or XG as they called it, they offered anywhere from 729 to just shy of 1400 AWM2 synthesized sounds, a smattering of effects for changing up those sounds, and input for adding an external instrument, expandability on the MU100 and greater with PLG cards, 16 to 64 part multi-timbrality, and much, much more, all at a price that severely undercut more professional romplers. So, that all begs some questions. Which one of the 15 models is right to buy? What problems will you have to worry about now and in the future with owning one? And at the end of it all, is it worth buying a Yamaha MU 20 years after the last one launched? In today's video, I'll be answering those questions and more. I'm Speedy, and welcome to the Yamaha MU episode of Sound Profile. Before we dive deep into all the differences between each model and all their functions, there's something I want to clarify. This review, retrospective, look back thingamajig is from the perspective of an MU1000 owner, and while I tried to write this review in such a way that it would accommodate owners of any MU model, I'm not going to cover every minute difference for the sake of brevity. That said, let's look at a basic feature list so you can know what to expect regardless of the model that you buy. Launching in 1994, the MU80 set the stage for every succeeding unit and features 64 voices of polyphony, 32-part multi-timbrality over MIDI DIN or RS-232C serial, 729 sounds and 21 drum kits, 10 types of reverb and chorus, and 43 variation effects consisting of delay, distortion, and many others, a dedicated section for distortion, overdrive, and free band EQ for one sound channel, a specialized graphic display that shows general information, a single instrument input for guitars and mics that can use the effects section, and stereo audio out over RCA. Launching 5 years and 3 major revisions later, and only in Japan, the MU1000 I have here amps things up quite a bit by offering 128 voice polyphony, 64-part multi-timbrality over serial and the then new USB standard, along with standard 32-part over MIDI DIN, 1,396 sounds and 58 drum kits, 18 types of reverb, 20 types of chorus, 116 variation effects, 4 dedicated effects units that use the same effects as the variation section, a 2-band EQ for each individual channel, 2 instrument inputs for external synths, guitars, and mics, which can be used as either a stereo pair or 2 mono inputs, stereo audio output via either digital or analog RCA, and a passive stereo audio pass-through. A slightly higher-end MU2000 also added a few additional features, most notably a 4MB sampler, basic MIDI sequencer, and a smart media card slot for managing the two. The MU1000, being the lower end unit, lacks all of those, though it's not too big of a deal as I can't imagine many people now would be sampling to one of these for any reason other than curiosity. Regardless of what model you decide to get though, the offensively offered offerings are pretty impressive considering the year each of them came out in, and the impressiveness extends to the cosmetic side of things. All models prior to the MU128 came exclusively in a half-rack 1-unit form factor with a slick black paint coat, which, while I don't have one on hand to show you, I've heard they do look pretty nice. What I can show you, however, is the 1K that I own, which follows in the footsteps of the MU128 released a year prior, giving users a stunning bluish silver plastic front panel to ogle and behold, complemented by a smattering of white buttons. At least I'm pretty sure they used to be white? Yeah, much like other electronics from the time that use beige or white plastics, there's some pretty bad yellowing at play here due to chemical breakdowns that can't really be avoided. Some units are worse than others, with the instrument buttons on mine being a particularly egregious example. It still doesn't look bad, but it's lost a little bit of its luster. Thankfully, the rest of the unit, including the dazzling green LED buttons in the actual front panel itself, hold up just fine, including the back of the unit. Flipping it over to that side reveals a variety of objects located on the reverse from front side of the unit, including 4 MIDI ports, MIDI in A, in B, out and through, an RS-232C serial port for hooking up to older computers, a USB port if you're lucky enough to own a computer that has one of those, a switch for switching between the switchable host modes, a 12-volt free amp DC power input, analog audio outputs and inputs via RCA, and digital output via optical SPDIF over Toslink. And yes, that is specifically an SPDIF output. While the Toslink style cables are normally used to carry Alesis light pipe or ADAT signals these days, this device outputs an SPDIF signal at 44.1 kHz. Once you have it working, it does actually sound pretty nice and undoubtedly provides the best signal quality possible from any MU, though I would argue that there isn't much of a difference between analog and digital here. It's also kind of annoying to set up, as not only is it locked to 44.1 kHz, but it can't even sync to an external source. So if you absolutely have to use it alongside something like a Korg Triton or Trinity that's locked to 48, well, I guess you can just die. Oh no. Speaking of our impending fate that dooms us all, it's worth noting that every model in the MU series with memory employs SRAM to save data upon power off, backed by either a CR2450 battery for the MU90 and earlier, and a CR2032 for the MU100 and later. As with any sort of battery, these can go bad over the years and require replacing, but unlike Roland synths, I haven't heard of any stories of them leaking out and damaging the synth itself. It's still worth opening up the unit to replace them though, as well as take a look at what's running everything behind the scenes, so let's do exactly that. While the process is slightly different between the MU100 and earlier and the 128 and later, it's quite similar. Turn the unit over to the back, remove all the screws present, flip it over to the bottom, remove the 4 binding screws, and then pull the bottom cover off. The only major difference between the two is that on the MU128 and later, you can't really remove the bottom panel as the connector for PLG cards is held in using a zip tie. So unless you want to cut that and add it back in later, it's just easier to put it to the side safely as it won't actually block your view of any internals. Speaking of, at the core of the MU units is either a Hitachi Super H processor for the MU100 or greater, and a Hitachi H8510 for the rest. These were both pretty popular choices at the time for music equipment, both having been used by Roland and Korg in a majority of their modules up until the early 2000s. They both offer a great price to performance ratio and high speeds at specific tasks, allowing for quick operation with no slowdown. Next up is the DAC used in every model, a UPD 63200GS. This is the same model used by Roland in their high-end JV1080 synthesizer, but unlike that and many other devices that use this DAC, the MUs all supposedly have it set to run at 18-bit output mode at 44.1 kHz. It should also be noted that the sound inputs on the back of models that have them send their signals through some amplifiers and straight to the analog outs. So if you're using your MU1000 or 2000 over digital audio, then you won't hear anything from these. I'm not sure why these don't get run for the analog to digital converter, but on the bright side of things, things, they do bypass the low-pass filter applied to the internal sound of the MU. On the topic of analog inputs, the 80 used for the inputs on the front, the ones that go for the effects engine and aren't just a simple pass-through, varies between models. Anything before the MU128 uses a converter by either Sanyo or Texas Instruments, but the MU128 and greater changed this out for a Burr Brown PCM 1800. Unfortunately, the bit depth of these is kind of a mystery. The service manuals claim the Sanyo and TI models run at 18-bit and the Burr Browns at 20-bit, but the Japanese manuals say the conversion is done at 16 bits. They still sound pretty darn good no matter what though. For sound generation, the MUs employ Yamaha's proprietary SWP synthesis chip, an advanced wave memory 2, or AWM2, based synthesizer that gets all of its sound data from the onboard ROM. The amount varies depending on the model, but the MU128 and higher contain approximately 24 megabytes. It's not on par with Roland's last desktop offering with the SC8850 at 32 megabytes, but size isn't all that matters, as you'll see later. There isn't too much to say about the rest of what's in here. It's mostly just bits and pieces to glue everything together, along with some less interesting but still important things like the coprocessors used for serial and USB data, so it's time to put it all back together and get it ready for use. In my case, it was a fairly simple procedure. Plug the power adapter into the port, use a stereo RCA to dual 1/4-inch mono cable for my audio signal, and a single USB Type B to Type A cable going to one of my USB hubs. As Yamaha has been using the same MIDI driver since 1999 and just continually updated it, all I had to do was download the latest 64-bit version of it off of their website and install it on my 2014 MacBook Pro to get it working over USB. Once I did that, I rebooted my laptop and it was immediately recognized as a MIDI synth by macOS and by extension Logic Pro. That said, I have been getting occasional pop-ups about it being an unoptimized plugin, meaning that it won't work once macOS 10.15 Catalina comes out. Given that this driver is used with synths at least as recent as 2015 with their Reface series, I'm pretty certain they'll update it for macOS Catalina, but just keep that in mind that if you buy one of the MU1000s or 2000s, you may be out of luck with USB MIDI for a while. Another quirk worth noting, which is thankfully less worrying, is that you'll probably get this host is offline error if you start up your MU on macOS. Assuming you have a stable USB connection with a good cable, then this error is nothing bad. It just means that nothing in the OS has tried to access the MU over USB yet. Opening up the Yamaha USB MIDI control panel or starting an application like Logic Pro makes this error go away. With everything ready to go, all you need to do is press the big old power button on the front, and after you're greeted by one of many random animations while the unit runs a few basic diagnostics, you're given the keys to play around with it and do whatever you want, starting with the play menu. By default, this shows you what the first 16 MIDI channels are doing, along with the current channel's patch and bank number, though it can be configured to show 32 or even up to 64 channels if you're daring enough. And by pressing the select left and select right buttons, you can scroll through the rest of the basic instrument settings like reverb, chorus, and variation send, volume level, pitch shifting, panning, expression, and that's it. It's arguably not as easy to use as, say, a Roland SC55 or 88 with their nicely laid out buttons for all basic functions accessible from a single menu, but this is still pretty dang nice and efficient, and I'd even go as far as to say it's better than Roland's SC8850 menus. After just a few minutes with the unit, I found myself able to whiz around the options at light speed, changing settings like nobody's business, and making small tweaks to my music as needed. But the most important thing you can do from this menu is pick out sounds from a selection that reaches well over 1,000 on later models, and assorting for them follows the general MIDI spec as a base. You have 128 sounds, referred to as the standard voices, which then have a number of sounds available in different sound banks, referred to as the voice variations. It's a run-of-the-mill sorting style for these GM-compliant synths, and it works pretty well here. You can even sort of forego the sorting entirely by setting the device to scroll through sounds and banks simultaneously, letting you easily sort through all the sounds in order, more like your typical synth would. The MU128 and later also further ease the finding of sounds and sorting of them by adding instrument category buttons to the front panel, allowing you to easily access any sound group with the click of a switch. And honestly, I still really like the sounds here. While most of them don't sound modern per se, they are still pretty usable in the context of 90s style music, and even outside of it if you manage to blend them into more modern music productions using effects and careful sound selections. Part of that's due to their rather unique sound? I've owned multiple products from Korg, Roland, and Yamaha, and none of them quite have the same sound texture as this thing. Looking past the cheese of certain patches, there's a crisp, pleasing feel to many of the ones on offer here, to the extent that I often find myself getting lost in the sound whenever I sit down to make music with it. One of my personal favorites is the Sweet TP trumpet, which, as the name implies, is a really sweet sounding trumpet. And then there's also stuff like Anavoice, Cheap Osk, Divinity, Van Allen, and even some of the basic GM tones like the oboe have a very pleasing sound to them that, despite having the same kind of instruments in significantly better quality elsewhere, I still find myself wanting to use the MU versions just because I like how they sound. Really, the only thing I'm not very fond of here are the drums. While some of the kits are nice, like the original standard kit and some of the ones added with the MU100 and beyond, many of them are also thin, weak, and very hard to work with if you don't heavily modify them. I hate to keep comparing these things to Roland's modules, especially when I said I wanted this review to be more focused on the merits of the MU, but it is a pretty stark contrast coming from the sound canvases, where even the SC55 back in 1991 had some perfectly usable, albeit very goofy drums, while I feel like it took Yamaha far too long to get any footing in that category, and even then, the later MU drums just don't blend in as well as the sound canvas drums. Now, something related to this that I should bring up is that there's technically two sets of samples in the MU series. If you buy an MU90 or earlier, then you're going to get a device that uses the earlier sample set that Yamaha used on their XG synths, and if you buy an MU100 or later, you get the new sample set. Neither is considerably better than the other as they both have their trade-offs. Many of the acoustic instruments sound nicer on the MU100, but I think some like the piano are genuinely worse. Sure, it's more realistic, but realistic in 1997 doesn't exactly mean quality or full of character in 2019, and in that regard I much prefer the old piano as it has that cheesy dance house vibe to it, much like the Korg M1. And, well, I suppose that kinda makes sense, as it's basically the same set of samples used for the SY-77's grand piano from 1989. The same can be said for a lot of other sounds here, actually, as they seem to be present in other products with better quality. In the case of the MU100 and beyond, I was able to recognize quite a few sounds from the QS300 and W7, but it seems like the samples are a little less rich in quality, and there's less multi-samples from what I can hear, so the sounds aren't as detailed. On top of that, sounds can only use up to 2 parts in their synthesis here, as opposed to 4 on other AWM2 synths, so there's less richness in general. I don't think it's as bad as a discrepancy between, say, a Roland sound canvas and one of their JV models or something, though. I ended up selling my SC8850 once I got hold of an expanded Phantom XR, as it had pretty much all of my favorite 8850 sounds in notably better quality. But even with access to an SY77 and plans to pick up a motif at some point, video foreshadowing, we're gonna talk about this, I can't really see myself selling this thing, as none of the later Yamaha modules have quite a similar enough sound to replace it. Even the QS300 and related are a fair bit different. Yeah, sure, they share some sounds, but there's also a ton that are missing, like the MU100 exclusive bank, so I feel pretty confident in saying that the MUs are the only way to get this particular brand of Yamaha. That does make me a bit disappointed in the lack of any full-on editing features though, because unlike those synths, you can't create any sounds from scratch here. The closest you get to an actual mode for synthesizing sounds is Performance mode, which is specifically designed for letting you layer multiple presets together to create new, rich sounds of your own, along with combining them with insertion effects and EQ. But this mode is not only monotimbral, but it still doesn't let you create new volume and pitch envelopes from scratch, edit LFOs, mix and match waveforms, so you can't really edit beyond what's already available in the aptly named edit menu. There's a decent amount of sound shaping options in there, with free filters, high and low pass cutoff and low pass resonance, along with vibrato, pitch and volume envelopes, automatic portamento, and perhaps most interestingly, a 2-band EQ on many of the later models. probably not the most useful thing now given how powerful the EQs built into most DAWs are, but if you want to work entirely in the box or play live with this thing, it's a handy way to free up some of that low and high end in a mix. All of that adds up to a very simple but very approachable selection of sound options for modifying the included presets to better suit any situation, and the editing functions get more interesting and ambitious once you start delving into the effects unit. You get the expected reverb and chorus, both of which sound pretty fantastic and have a huge number of presets that are highly adjustable, and alongside those are the variation and insert units. Variation functions in two ways. It's either a global effect that functions like the reverb and chorus, where you can send sounds into it with a value of 0 to 127, 0 being nothing and 127 being completely wet, or you can use it as an insert, functioning exclusively on one sound. The amount of effects available varies pretty wildly depending on what MU you own, but my MU1000X here has just shy of 120, and that encompasses practically anything you can imagine. Numerous kinds of reverbs, distortions, flangers, rotary speakers, delays, auto panners, tremolos, amp sims, EQs, wah-wahs, pitch shifters, compressors, noise gates, and so on, and even some more esoteric ones like the lo-fi effect that's only available on the MU100 and up, which I honestly prefer to the bit crusher built into my DAW due to the sheer amount of settings and tweaks available here. It's legit powerful stuff. Things get considerably more impressive once you start dealing with the later models as well. While the MU80 only allowed you to use one variation effect along with either distortion, overdrive, or a free band EQ tacked onto a single sound, the MU90 added 2 insertion processors with 40 free effects each for use alongside the variation, with the MU100 and 128 following its example until the 1000 and 2000 came along with a whopping 97 effects and 4 insertion processors alongside the variation processor. They also added some consistency between the two, as the 90, 100, and 128 had somewhere around 70 variation effects but only 43 usable on the insertion processors, while the MU1K and 2K just made everything consistent and allowed you to put whatever effects wherever you wanted. A very welcome addition indeed. The quality of the effects here is pretty consistently good too. I was surprised at just how usable they were and even find myself using them outside of music production, just so I could mess with things like sound effects, bit crush samples, and so on. This is also probably a good time to mention the X update for the 1K and 2K. This adds another 19 effects to the unit, an option to boost volume by 6 or 12 decibels for the digital output, some more presets for the AD inputs, more output routing options, and some other minor tweaks, including the removal of the demo songs in the MU1000. I couldn't exactly figure out why they're missing, but my best guess is that the memory they're stored in has to be used for storing data for the new effects like ring modulation, tempo-based flangers, phasers, and delays, and so on. So Yamaha opted to include them as .mid files with the update download for playback in a sequencer. One other minor tweak worth noting is that the TG300B mode was renamed to Roland GS with the update, as Yamaha finally secured a license for it. It's been rumored on forums that this changed the sound of the mode, but thanks to the help of viewer and member of the Desktop MIDI Central Discord, Iridescent Audio, or Dave Harris, we were able to find out this isn't actually the case. I got him to record one of the GS compatible tunes I did for Planet X-Free's soundtrack on his MU100 with the TG300B mode against my MU1000 with the Roland GS mode, and the results were exactly the same. If there's any difference between the two, I sure can't spot it, and going by other recordings I've heard online of games like Descent that were also identical, it's safe to say this is entirely a branding thing. Corporate shenanigans aside, if you end up buying an MU1K or 2K that hasn't already been upgraded, then I would highly recommend doing it yourself, as the extra effects are nice to have, and the digital gain setting is almost a must depending on your setup, as the signal can be pretty quiet at 0 decibel gain. Yamaha was even kind enough to put the upgrade program in English, so as long as your operating system isn't running in Japanese. The only caveat is that you have to run the upgrader under Windows or on macOS 10.14 or lower with Wine, as the native Mac version hasn't been updated since the PowerPC days. So you may have to borrow a friend's computer to do the upgrade, and as it takes an excruciating 15 minutes to complete, I hold no responsibility for any lost friendships this agonizing wait may cost you. If that guilt is too much for you to bear, then you shouldn't fret, as upgraded models seem to be way more popular for sellers to list on auction sites than untouched ones. This is how I got my MU1000, so I never had to deal with the upgrader. Just make sure to get photos from the seller showing the little X text on boot to verify they didn't make an error when listing, as there's no other immediate signs of an upgrade besides that. That is, unless you buy a later MU2000, as Yamaha started shipping them out with the firmware pre-installed. These can be differentiated by the presence of a GS logo under the plug for XG marking, along with the TG300B mode text being replaced by GS. Speaking of the MU2000, now would be a good time to go over the differences between it and the 1000 in more detail. At least as much as I can, given I don't own one, I'm just friends with people who do. The only changes that I'm aware of are all related to the smart media slot tucked on the bottom left corner, a sequencer, and a sampler. There isn't much online about the sequencer, other than that it's capable of loading whole playlists of MIDI files from the SM card, as well as recording incoming MIDI data into a standard MIDI file. I suppose this could be useful for recording data played live, but I'm not sure where you'd be using this thing without a computer by its side, and you could just as easily record to that. What I find more interesting here is the sampler, capable of loading 4 megabytes of instruments into memory and using them as regular tones. Once again, there's not much about this function online, but there are some excellent tunes that use it, with the best example being Q2-435's cover of Mining Melancholy from Donkey Kong Country 2. It sounds nearly identical to the original tune. It's crazy cool. Another example is Master Jace's great cover of Desert Planet from Super Star Path, which you should totally buy because my friend and previous Sound Profile guest star, Movie Movies 1, did the music for it. Anyways, the sampler is used here for some FM drums which sound absolutely pristine. Whether or not the sampler is worth it is going to be something you have to decide for yourself. Personally, I'm happy with sticking with the one built in the Logic Pro and the ones in my Korg Triton and Trinity, but for someone who wants to get into hardware sampling and desktop MIDI modules, it'd be a neat way to check 2 boxes off, so as long as you keep in mind you're not exactly getting the most full-featured sampler ever made, at least to my knowledge. On a note tangibly related to sampling, let's talk about that instrument input. Since it accepts any line, mic, or guitar level signal over 1/4-inch mono connectors, you could theoretically connect anything, though a number of presets are included for microphones, guitars, and synths, along with a generic line level signal option. It's a nifty feature to have for sure, especially since you can apply any insertion effects to the incoming signal, making these things surprisingly great multi-effects boxes for guitarists and synth players. And despite the age and more low-end professional focus of the units, the inputs do an impressive job at capturing the audio sent into them without any easily noticeable loss in detail, at least when listening on my well-worn Sony MDR-7506s. The signal-to-noise ratio is also darned impressive. I was able to plug in an electric guitar and use the tube amp setting with little noise, as you just heard, and I haven't had any problems with my synths. But let's say you get tired of everything that's included and want to take things to the next level. Add more synth engines, more sounds, more everything really. This is where the PLG or plug cards come into play. Released alongside the MU100, these things are more or less entire synthesizers on boards, complete with CPUs, dedicated synth engines, memory, and everything else short of power and display circuitry. This allows them to operate alongside the MU and any other compatible synthesizer without having an impact on their performance. A fully decked out MU100 or 128 could handle anything you threw at it, which was honestly quite a lot given what was sold on market. While 5 of the card types are completely unique, the remaining 5 are related to other Yamaha products in some way. The DX card, for example, is based on the DX7, so it's a monotimbral 16-voice polyphonic 6-operator FM synthesizer. I don't own one of these myself, as I don't see a reason to, given that I already have an SY77, another DX-compatible synth, but once again, Iridescent Audio helped me out here as he has one in his MU100 and gave me his thoughts on it after I asked. So, a thanks to him again. I would highly recommend checking out his music and supporting him if you get the chance. He does great work. Anyways, from what he mentioned, there's a few things that make the DX card still worthwhile. For one, they integrate well with the effects section of the MU, making it easy to beef up and stylize some pads and classic 80s sounds. It's also completely free of the trappings of any modern day DX-like soft synths, so you don't have to worry about audio latency, artifacting, dropouts, and other problems that can plague software solutions. The features of it go beyond the basic DX7 clone as well, considering that you can combine AWM2 sounds from the MU with FM sounds from the DX, and there's even a number of performance mode patches set up to do that for you. It's definitely one of those things where value is in the eye of the beholder, given how many synths have improved on the DX7 and how many software versions we have of it, but I can still see it being something that's worth owning today. As for some other cards, the AN and VL are cut-down versions of the AN1X and VL70M respectively, but probably the most interesting is the SG, which would later go on to form the basis for the elusive and pricey FS1R synth that everyone wants, but no one can actually convince themselves to buy because it's $1,000. It's also the only one that I own, sorta. I won't go into too much detail here as I already did a 22-minute long video that tells you everything you need to know, but the uses for this thing are really limited, and unless you need some quirky format synthesis in your life, it's tough to recommend. Now, the reason I had to say sorta just a second ago is because I do kind of own a VL card. Specifically, I have the module that they're based on, the VL70M. The only difference between this and one of the plug cards is that the VL70M is a standalone module that's more closely related to the MU80, just with the AWM2 synth chips swapped out for a VL chip and other changes to facilitate that. It uses basically the same shell though, and even has the effects section of it built in. It also has a socketed swappable sounds ROM unlike the plugs, which means it's possible to exchange it for a third-party one like the famous Patchman Turbo Bank. Compared to the SG, which is hard for me to advise anyone to purchase, I can't think of a reason why I wouldn't recommend someone to buy one of these or a plug VL, as they're based on trying to replicate the acoustic properties of an instrument rather than use sampled recordings of one. The synthesis engine is extremely flexible and realistic not just for 1996, but even today, and to my knowledge there aren't really any soft synths that use physical modeling in a way as expansive as this. And sure, there's Piano Tech for physically modeled pianos, Arch for some stringed instruments, and Sample Modeling's excellent SWAM engine products, but none of these have the flexibility of a plug VL or VL70M, which are capable of stunning brasses, woodwinds, strings, guitars, ethnic instruments, synth leads, and odd imaginary instruments that combine properties of all of those together. Considering that you can often buy an MU100 and plug VL together for less than the cost of a VL70M, this card alone makes a compatible MU worth the purchase, and if you play a Yamaha WX, an Iwi, or any sort of wind controller, this is an absolute must-own. And yes, for the curious, there will be a full video on this later down the line. As for the rest of the cards, I don't have any opinion on them and I don't have any friends who own them, so there's nothing I can say that you couldn't already get from listening to a YouTube demo. Okay, with all that out of the way, it's time for the dedicated demo reel segment. I've gotten a mixture of tunes to show off, ranging from covers of game music, original tunes made using just the MU, music mixed with other synths, solo instrument demos, and music from the collaborative Power XG album that's launched alongside this video, a collection of songs made by members of the highly talented and aforementioned Desktop MIDI Central Discord server. I highly recommend you check out the full thing when you're done with this video, but until then, enjoy! Despite the cheese factor present in many of the sounds, I still think the MUs are highly versatile boxes of sounds that are just tons of fun to work with. The limitations you're given are a lot less restrictive than some of the other smaller MIDI modules of the time, but they still force you to get creative in many ways, so I always found myself having a blast trying to come up with new and unique ways to manipulate sounds and get the results I was after. And before we get too off the topic of music playback, now would be a good time to look at the MIDI standard compatibility here. Depending on the model you get, you'll have a wide variety of them to use, with General MIDI, Yamaha XG, and Roland GS being supported on all models, except for the GM-only MU5, but no one talks about that one, and General MIDI 2 being standard on the 1K and 2K, with a firmware update for the 128 called 128V2 adding support. Out of all the synths I've tried of GS music, I would have to say that the MUs are the only ones that come close to a sound canvas unit in terms of quality. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that they're often superior to them. The mixing is usually spot on, and the great quality of Yamaha's samples breathe new life into something as old as an SC55 demo song, and all the games I've played with them honestly sound pretty awesome. GM music, on the other hand, is, well, it's very model dependent. If you own an MU90 or earlier, or set your MU100 or later to use that old instrument set, then everything I said about the GS mode applies here. It's well balanced, rich, and very enjoyable to listen to. But in the MU100 map, it's a mixed bag. When things sound better, they sound better, and when they sound worse, they're much worse. Because of this, I always put my MU1000 into GS mode when playing games, as this always uses the older MU sounds and, in my opinion, sounds way better. But hey, which of these two do you prefer? Still though, GS and all the other modes aren't the main attraction of these synths. XG is. Coming out a few years after Roland's GS standard, XG adds a heck of a lot more features with way more instruments and more effects, which made it practically impossible to clone, but what XG lacked in third-party support, it made up for by being put into basically everything possible by Yamaha, creating an entire ecosystem out of it with computer expansion cards, portable sequencers, modules, keyboards, heck, even game consoles, as the Sega Dreamcast had built-in XG MIDI support. I'd still argue that MU modules are the best place to experience XG though, primarily just because of the extra instruments offered by them and their popularity as XG modules, giving you both the widest range of music to listen to and the most flexibility with sound creation. There's also a lot of history to be gleaned from these modules, as some rather fantastic musicians got their start using them. One of the most well-known with gamers is probably Saitama Saisu Heiki, better known as SSH, or better known as that guy who made that arrange of Metal Squad from Thunder Force 4 that went slightly viral a few years back. Before all that though, he made a number of arranges with his MU2000 at his side, and they're as awesome as you'd expect. That's not to say other XG devices didn't have their fair share of cool users though. One neat example is Yasutaka Nakata. Nowadays, he acts as a producer for some J-pop bands as well as making his own tunes, but some of his earliest recorded works were Yamaha XG tunes, one of which was good enough to score 3rd place in the 3rd annual XG Data Contest of Japan, earning him $1,000 worth of Yamaha instruments. Man, am I the only person who'd love to see a contest like that now? Just imagine Korg challenging people to make a piece of music with just one Korg synth, for Yamaha doing the same but with their Motif series. Anyways, while we're still vaguely on the topic of XG, now might be a good time to talk about that whole map thing I've been mentioning. On the MU100 and later, you can go into Util, System, and move to Map to change between MU100 Native and MU Basic. The former uses the newer set of samples, and the latter uses the earlier ones from the MU90 and before. As far as I can tell, the MU Basic mode is 100% accurate and compatible with older models, and a dozen or so pieces of XG music I've listened to, I haven't been able to spot any difference between the music being played back on something like an MU80 or the DB51XG I have in my Corgan X5R and my MU1000 in basic mode. One other thing that I should also note regarding playback, if you're just here to buy a module to play back XG tunes and other music with that signature Yamaha sound, you don't need to buy the best money can afford. The MU50 sounds exactly the same as the 80 and 90 for GM, GS, and XG music, and the MU100 is identical to the 128, 1K, and 2K in the same scenarios. It's really music production where your choice of model makes a difference. Speaking of which, if at this point I've convinced you to pick up an MU or at least give them a good look, then there are some things you should consider and some alternatives. Which model you get is undoubtedly going to be the most important part of your purchase, as there's quite a few to choose from. If you're going to be making music with them, then I'd recommend skipping the MU1580, as these both lack the dedicated effects section of the MU90 and greater that really helps out when making music. And preferably, you'd want to get an MU100 or better, as they can take plug cards, have the newer, better instruments, and more variation effects. You can expect to pay about $120 for an MU90 or 90R, and $150 for an MU100, or just shy of $200 if you go for a 128 or 100R. Oh yeah, I guess I should talk about the rack mount models real quick. In an attempt to appeal to Americans, according to Yamaha, they released these models, which are double the size of the original desktop versions, but the MU100 can take 2 expansion cards, and both the MU100R and 90R have 2 instrument inputs, along with a slew of other things like quarter-inch outputs that make them more professional. Another interesting thing about them is that the MU100R shipped with both of the plug slots occupied, with the VL and VH cards pre-installed. If you buy one of these, then make sure you know if you're getting the cards with it or not. Most sellers seem to either strip them out or buy ones that have had them stripped out, and the ones that do include the cards are often sold for more as if it were something extra. Anyways, the best unit to own would obviously be either an MU1000 or 2000, but the reality is, these are too rare to be easy for most people to buy, with any decent priced listings disappearing almost as soon as they come up. And decent price in this context being $250 at the minimum, upwards of $320. I personally paid $250 shipped out of Japan for my upgraded MU1000X, which is about average for one, and I can't say I regret spending as much as I did, especially since there's been a drought of them for the past few months I've been doing research. If there's any recommendations as to what you shouldn't buy, I'd skip over to B models. These are cheaper, screenless units, which means no onboard editing, and the price difference is so minuscule that it isn't really worth the $10 in savings, if even that, as they can sometimes cost as much as the regular models. Unless you can get one for like super cheap, maybe $60, and you really want a MIDI module for gaming, skip them. This also extends to the Yamaha MU500, which, while it doesn't carry the B series moniker, is just as bad. These are based on the MU1000 and 2000 sound set, but use the effects engine of the MU100, has no plug slots, no instrument inputs, yet costs at least as much as an MU100. There's also the MU5, 10, and 15, which I've really neglected to talk about throughout this video because they're pretty much all lacking in the features that make the MU so interesting. They're all basic XG boxes, with exception to the MU10, as that features instrument inputs and QS300-like synthesis, but since it has no screen, you're stuck with editing using dated computer applications. On the bright side, they are pretty cheap nowadays, regularly selling for $40 to $60, but I can't say I'm particularly interested in ever getting one, and I have a hard time recommending them. So, about alternatives to these things. As I've mentioned tons of times in this video, if you want a more professional synth with a similar sound, you could get a QS300, as that features a lot of similar tones, but also has XG support. But this, along with other professional XG compliant keyboards like the CS1X, are more focused on achieving other things, with XG being added on as an aside. The synths that come the closest to competing with the MU are the Yamaha products focused primarily on XG support, like the DB50XG and the SYXG50 soft synth. And sure enough, these do come pretty close to having the same level of power as an MU, but these have a number of features that are either gimped or lacking. No insertion effects unit, no EQ, less editing functions, far less sounds, no AD inputs, no performance mode, no plug support, less effects, worse editing interfaces, less polyphony, less parts. And while some of these have their own advantages, like the QY70 and QY100 being Game Boy-sized MIDI sequencers with XG sounds built in, none of them come quite close to the power of a full MU unit in terms of sound generation. The only one that I think really comes close is the SW1000XG PC expansion card, which is pretty much an MU100 shrunk down to a single slot PCI card. However, this hasn't been supported by Yamaha in forever, and official driver support only goes up to Windows XP. As far as I'm aware, no one has had any success running it on Windows 7 64-bit or greater. The only place you'll really see true competition is in the world of ROM players and desktop MIDI boxes. Specifically, the closest comparisons would be some of Korg's AI2 synths, namely the N5s, and Roland's Sound Canvas series, both of which I've done videos on in some form, and I'd recommend watching those before making your purchasing decision. Are they better than the MUs? Well, I don't know if I'd say better. They're just different, and it's all down to personal preference, which you prefer. Personally, I've found myself growing more attached to my MU1K than I did my SC8850, to the point where I can't say I'm exactly sad over selling the 8850 to a good friend, but I'd be legitimately disappointed if someone tried to take my MU away from me just because of how good it's been. There really isn't anything that's, well, exactly like it, I guess, which makes it really valuable to me and my music setup. And it's for that and pretty much every reason mentioned in this video that I highly recommend purchasing a Yamaha MU if what I said has captured your interest at all. There's something to be said for a simple, easy-to-use box of hundreds of sounds that blend well with each other, covering everything from acoustic pianos to Zyphers, with an insanely powerful and still relevant effects section that makes them perfect multi-effects boxes thanks to the instrument inputs, and that along with the great expandability, generally affordable pricing, high-quality audio output. These things are just brimming with personality from their fantastic usability, beautiful designs, and cute little touches, like the icons that accompany every instrument, the random boot and idle animations with this adorable cat person thing that stops by to say hi or throw on sunglasses. There's just so much to love that made them brilliant in their day, and I still consider them to be brilliant now. Highly capable, highly adaptable, and highly enjoyable, a Yamaha MU is a great addition to any home studio looking to add some affordable 90s flair to their setup.